Man After Man, An Anthropology of the Future. Written by Dougal Dixon, with illustrations by Philip Hood. Introduction: Evolution and Man. Evolution is the process that brought us to where we are today. It started about 3,500 million years ago, when the first living thing, probably a single complex organic molecule in the form of a long chain, began to reproduce itself. It did this by latching onto simpler molecules dissolved in the water around it, until it built up a mirror image of itself. The two parts then split apart to become two identical complex molecules. Each of these had the same power of attracting simpler molecules and building up a mirror image, similar to the way in which viruses reproduce themselves. The building up and the splitting took place untold millions of times. Inevitably, on occasion, the mirror image so produced was not accurate. As a result, the new molecule had slightly different properties from the old, and may not have been so efficient at reproducing itself. In this case, the changed molecule, the mutation, stopped reproducing and died out. However, the occasional mutation arose that actually helped the molecule to reproduce itself. The mirror images, the offspring, of this mutation then survived. This is the basis of the process that we call evolution. After millions of beneficial chance mutations, the single molecule became more and more complex, if complexity ensured a more efficient reproductive process. The molecule changed from a virus-like entity to a living cell, in which the reproductive molecule or molecules were encased and protected by an outer membrane. This resembled one of our modern bacteria. The chemical reactions that enabled early molecules to reproduce themselves may have been insufficient to power the reproduction of more advanced creatures, and other energy sources developed that allowed the absorption of energy from sunlight and the use of this energy to build up raw materials for reproduction. The first single-celled plants had evolved. Other mutated cells did not use the sun's energy. Instead, they digested the cells that did, and so used the energy already stored. These were the first animals. Eventually, creatures evolved that consisted of more than just a single cell. This came about either by cells reproducing themselves and then failing to split, or by several cells coming together. Whichever it was, if the multi-celled creature were more efficient, then it survived and reproduced in its multicellular form. With the increasing complexity, the different cells in a single creature evolved to have different functions. Some cells were involved in sense, helping the creature to find food or light. Other cells were involved in locomotion, in moving the whole creature towards its food or its light source. Others were involved in digestion, others in reproduction, and so on. The different masses of cells are what we call tissues, and the structures that they form, each with a different function, are called organs. An entire creature, made up from molecules that make cells, that make tissues, that make organs, is called an organism. At an early stage, the pathways of evolution began to branch, and different types of organism developed. Wherever there was a food source that could be exploited, evolution produced an organism able to exploit it. Such a process is called adaptive radiation, and we can see it at work today. Many species of finch live in the Galapagos Islands off the west coast of South America. These all evolved from one type of seed-eating ground finch that came over from the mainland and spread to all the islands, each with different habitats and food sources. The finches on each island evolved to take advantage of their particular habitat. As a result, there are now many species of finch on the islands, including heavy-beaked forms that eat seeds, short-beaked forms that eat buds and fruit, and long-beaked forms that eat insects. Environments are not stable, they change for one reason or another. When this happens, a creature evolved to live in a particular way in a certain environment becomes extinct. For example, if all the insects on the Galapagos Islands died out, then the long-beaked finches would become extinct, a process known as natural selection. If the insects became extinct, their places would be taken by another creature, and some other bird would evolve to eat that. Evolution produces specific shapes of animals to live in particular environments. Grass is tough to eat, so an animal that eats grass needs strong teeth and a specialized digestive system. Grasslands are wide open areas in which danger can be seen coming from a long way away, and there are no hiding places. A grass-eating animal, therefore, tends to have long running legs, as well as strong teeth, and a long face so that its eyes are above the level of the grass while its head is down eating. This gives us the shape of the antelope, the typical grass-eating animal of Africa. However, the grasslands of Australia have evolved a quite unrelated grass-eating animal, the kangaroo. There seems little resemblance between this and the antelope of Africa. It does, however, have the same long face with similar grass-grinding teeth, and the legs are long and built for speed, albeit in a bounding rather than running gait. This development of similar features in unrelated animals in response to similar environmental conditions is what is known as convergent evolution. It accounts for the similarities between seals and sea lions, aardvarks and anteaters, ants and termites, vultures and condors. A similar phenomenon is parallel evolution. In this, two branches of the same family tree develop along similar lines independently of one another. For example, the kit fox of North America and the fennec fox of Africa are both small with a sandy pelt and large ears. The ears act as cooling vanes and prevent each animal overheating in its desert environment, and the pelt is camouflage. Both are descended from a more conventional fox-like animal, but each has evolved separately to live in different deserts. The different colours and patterns in animals can also be attributed to evolutionary processes. Animal patterns may camouflage them. On the other hand, they may, like the skunk, have striking colours that warn a would-be attacker that the owner is poisonous. Some animals mimic others, as when a harmless king snake develops the spectacular pattern of the poisonous coral snake, and consequently turns away potential enemies. All of these have developed because the animals concerned have benefited from them, have survived, and have gone on to reproduce. Throughout the world and throughout time, animals and plants have changed in response to the changes in the environment. One species has broken with this tradition. Within the last million years or so, the human species Homo sapiens evolved. It has come all the way from molecules to its present form in 3,500 million years by the workings of evolution. Now, within the last few millennia, intelligence has developed, and with it cultures and civilizations. The species has spread not by changing to adapt to the environments it found, but by changing the environments to suit itself. Instead of developing furry pelts and layers of insulating fat to adapt to cold conditions, it manufactures artificial coverings and uses available energy supplies to generate heat for the body. Instead of evolving heat-radiating structures such as big ears to adapt to hot conditions, it manufactures refrigeration and air conditioning systems, again using available energy supplies. Instead of developing speed and killing strategies that allow it to hunt a particular food, it builds machines to do it. By using its intelligence, it can exploit all food supplies in all environments without having to change itself. Medical science eliminates much of the effects of natural selection. No longer does an individual not particularly well adapted to the environment die out before being able to reproduce. Under natural conditions, not all offspring of a species survive, and this is reflected in the birth rate. Thanks to medical science, more offspring of Homo sapiens survive than ever could have before, but this has not been reflected in a corresponding drop in the birth rate. As a result, the populations of Homo sapiens are growing without the refining and modifying processes of natural selection. Evolution as we know it for Homo sapiens has stopped. However, this does not mean that the process of change has necessarily stopped. As science develops, the reproductive molecules, the genes, that exist within every cell of the human body are becoming better and better understood. When Homo sapiens finally appreciates which parts control the development of which features, then the possibility exists for modifying the process. A stage will be reached when one gene can be suppressed, another encouraged, with yet another created from new. A human being with particular features, following a particular preconceived plan, may be born from modified sperm cells and ova. Without the natural processes of modification, this unnatural process is the only way of developing the species into new forms to face the problems that await it in the future, problems generated by overpopulation, overuse of natural resources, and pollution. Genetic engineering. The mechanics of genetic engineering are already complex, yet in their current state they are primitive compared to what will undoubtedly be possible within a few decades. The reproductive molecules that lie at the nucleus of each cell of a living organism are in the form of long structures called chromosomes. These chromosomes are made up of the chemical substance DNA. Its shape is best imagined as a long ladder that has been twisted along its length. Each rung of this ladder consists of two compounds, called bases, locked together. There are only 4 different kinds of bases: thymine, cytosine, adenine, and guanine, referred to as T, C, AS, and G. A T always unites with an A, and a C always with a G. The sequence of these base pairs along the twisted ladder of the chromosome is almost infinitely variable. There are something like 6 billion bases in a full set of human chromosomes. A chromosome is often described as a page in an instruction manual. Each base pair, or rung in the ladder, represents a letter of the alphabet, and the arrangement along the ladder gives words and sentences. Each understandable instruction so formed gives a gene. The genes in a single cell produce the total information needed for the growth of the entire organism. When an organism grows and develops, it does so by multiplication of cells. Each cell splits into 2 complete cells. When this happens, each chromosome in the cell actually splits down the middle. The uprights of the twisted ladder pull away from one another, as the rungs split into 2 along the joins between the bases. What happens then is that these 2 half-ladders build up 2 complete ladders by attracting free bases made up from the chemicals drifting in the cell. As a result, when the cell splits into 2, each new cell carries exactly the same set of gene instructions. The exception to this process is in sexual reproduction. Reproductive cells carry half the normal number of chromosomes. 2 half cells unite during fertilization to produce 1 cell with a full number. This new cell is a unique mix of genes, half from the mother and half from the father. This cell then divides in the usual manner until the entire organism is built up, following the instructions now carried in every cell. The big mystery now is this: how do the genes, the pattern of base pairs along a chromosome, actually work? How do they control the construction of an organism? The idea behind genetic engineering is to manipulate natural processes. In some way, genetic instructions along the chromosomes in a cell have to be identified, then changed, so that as the organism grows, it is to a new set of instructions. Since all the materials involved, cells, chromosomes, molecules, are microscopic, a whole new technology has to be applied. Viruses can do it. Viruses essentially consist of a mass of their own DNA encased in an envelope. When they infect a cell, they attach themselves to the cell's wall and inject their DNA through it. In the cell's interior, the invading DNA breaks down the cell's chromosomes and rebuilds the material into copies of itself. For genetic engineers to do the same, they would first of all have to break in through the cell wall, then break down the DNA of the nucleus and reassemble it in the desired way. Alternatively, they could cut out segments of the DNA strand, segments that correspond to particular genes, and replace them with DNA segments already prepared. This would be done by chemicals that have specific biochemical reactions, enzymes, some of which have been found to have the ability to cut DNA strands. The greatest experimental successes so far have been with bacteria. These single-celled creatures have cell walls that can be softened by chemical solutions so that new DNA can be placed inside. The double helix of the original chromosome can be chopped up using enzymes, and new DNA can be inserted. The broken ends of the DNA strands have one side longer than the other, exposing a sequence of bases. If the introduced DNA segment has matching bases exposed at its end, the two DNA pieces will unite, T to A and C to G, and produce a complete chromosome. This technique is known as gene splicing. Before any of this can be attempted, however, the whole gene pattern has to be mapped. At the moment, only about 100 human genes have been identified and interpreted, but since genetics has only been in existence for a century, and the structure of the chromosome has only been known for about 4 decades, and scientific advance in this area is increasing exponentially, what was speculation about genetic engineering is quickly becoming fact. Part 1. In the beginning, the human story so far. 8 million years ago. Her ancestors lived in the treetops that once covered the area. Indeed, her relatives still live in the forests of the steamy lowlands, climbing the branches, eating the soft fruits and grubs. Her way of life is, however, completely different. Hers is a dry landscape of yellow grass, with brown and black thickets of hardy thorn trees. Her woodland diet is different, too, because there are no soft fruits and juicy buds or grubs here. Solid nuts and tough seeds are her main foodstuffs, and when there is nothing else, she makes do with coarse roots and tubers. Hard-shelled insects and dry lizards abound, and she often extracts what little nutrition there is from these. Her jaws and teeth reflect the fact that she has to eat more than her ancestors did to gain the same amount of goodness, and she has to chew it more thoroughly. Accordingly, her front teeth have become smaller to make room for broad and flat back teeth that grind down masses of coarse food. This has not happened suddenly, but has developed over thousands and thousands of years. Those who study her remains will give her a name. They will call her Ramapithecus. The other animals that live here show the same specializations in their teeth. Pigs and antelope feed on low-lying plants, and giraffes browse the higher trees. These two have broad back teeth, but she has a long way to go before she is as well adapted as they are. For one thing, the grasses are very tall, and when she is on the ground she is lost, and cannot peer over them. There are fierce hunting beasts around too, so she needs to climb the trees for safety as well as to see distances. The other animals run away when threatened, but she does not have the speed, running on all fours on short limbs. Stiffly, she pushes herself to her hind feet and sways unsteadily for a time. Now she can see over the top of the grass, and, what's more, she feels cooler. Less of her back is exposed to the hot sun, and the cool breeze that she now feels soothes her neck and chest. Overheating was not a problem in forest shade. The more comfortable temperature, however, is counteracted by discomfort in her legs, as this is not a natural pose for her. Maybe she can move more quickly like this, with only 2 feet touching the ground. She tries, but her legs are not strong enough, and are the wrong shape for this to work. Her body naturally topples forwards, and she cannot move her hind legs quickly enough to stay upright. She descends once more onto all fours. No, she will have to stay near the trees if she wants to survive. 3 million years ago. The climate is much drier now, and the scenery has changed considerably. The continent has been moving, gradually splitting the landscape across with faults, while elongated slabs have slowly subsided, forming long, deep rift valleys with strings of shallow lakes in their floors. Molten material has been brought up from the Earth's interior, and active volcanoes line the edges of the rift. Grasslands have spread everywhere, and there are many clumps of trees, but no continuous forest. At the edge of one such clump, a small creature drops from a tree to the ground, and then stands upright. He looks around for danger, and, seeing none, grunts a signal. The dozen others who drop from the branches and cluster around him include other males, much smaller females, some with babies, and children. It is a large family group. Food has become sparse in their thicket, and they are moving. Further down the valley, a patch of green by a lake holds out some hope. With a confident stride, they march downhill, leaving footprints in the volcanic ash that carpets the whole area from the last eruption. Their stride and stance show that their legs have developed considerably in the last 5 million years. From permanently bowed structures only good for climbing trees, their legs have developed into straight limbs that can carry their bodies vertically. Their arms, however, have changed little during that time. They still have the curved fingers for grasping branches and the shoulder socket angled upwards, allowing a high reach, both features of a tree-living way of life. If the landscape becomes much drier though, and the trees more sparse, beings that are better adapted for a ground-dwelling existence will be more likely to survive than this partially tree-living creature, Australopithecus afarensis. That time is not far off. 2.5 million years ago. Volcanoes still bubble, grassy plains still spread along the rift valleys, but now only isolated umbrella-shaped trees and low thorn thickets break up the yellow of the landscape. Down by the edge of the lake, a pack of large hyenas has brought down an animal that looks like a short-necked giraffe with moose-like horns and are tearing its corpse apart. In one mass of bushes, a number of heavy-looking beasts forage amongst the thorny vegetation for leaves and berries. If it were not for their upright stance, they would be mistaken for chimpanzees, as they have the same heavy bodies and the same deep jaws with massive teeth. These also belong to a species of Australopithecus, called Australopithecus robustus, and they are perfectly at home here as they contentedly chew any piece of vegetable material they find. Suddenly, the nearby grass erupts. About a dozen screeching figures run at the feeders. They look much like the others, but are more lightly built, and their faces do not have such a heavy-jawed look. They belong to another species, A. africanus. The feeders stop eating and snarl back, staring defensively at the newcomers and showing their teeth and gums. They are not to be chased away from their feeding ground. The attackers halt in their assault. Their intended victims seem more determined than they had anticipated. The attackers back away slowly, keeping up their aggressive noises and trying not to appear vulnerable, then regroup some distance away. The berries of the thicket are lost to them. They turn their attention to the hyenas feeding down by the lake and, as a group, charge them. The hyenas are startled by this sudden assault, and in a panic they abandon their kill. The attackers gather around the corpse, some of them tearing at the meat while others stand guard, waving sticks and snarling at the cheated hyenas. These creatures can eat meat as well as plants, and can combine forces in order to procure it. Their larger relatives, in the thicket, continue munching their berries. Meat-eating and cooperative hunting is not for them. 1.5 million years ago. It seems the same place, for the landscape has changed very little, though the climate is now much cooler. Large chimpanzee-like creatures still forage for berries amongst the bushes. These creatures, however, are larger than the earlier berry-eaters and have very heavy jawbones. Later anthropologists gave them various names, such as Zinjatheropus, Nutcracker Man, before deciding that they were members of the earlier A. robustus. Not far away, several very much smaller ape-like beasts, evolved from the earlier A. africanus, carry a dead antelope between them. That is not all they carry. They have stones that have been chipped into edges, points and blades, for these creatures are tool makers, and as such they have a culture, later referred to as the Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age. Their scientific name reflects this tool-making skill. It is Homo habilis, meaning handyman. The two groups pass very close to one another, but totally ignore each other's presence. Now they have evolved in such diverse directions, they no longer compete for the same food. 500,000 years ago. She is a member of the first group of humanoid creatures to move out of Africa and spread across Europe and Asia. She crouches in a cave entrance in what will be known as China, but far away, in places that will be called Spain, Java and Tanzania, there are beings just like her. If she stood up, she would be seen to be very similar to a 20th century human, but with a heavier jaw, protruding eyebrows, and a flat forehead. Her upright stance gives her species the name Homo erectus. As she watches the hunters drag home the slain bison while other females carry back their handfuls of hackberries and pine kernels, her thoughts are only on the food that they bring and how this food is to be prepared. Cooperation with others and skills learned from her parents provide her with food. With a stick she stirs the powdery whiteness in the fire pit before her, uncovering the deep red glow. She adds dry twigs to bring the glowing embers to life. She cannot remember when or how the fire started, but hers is the responsibility for keeping it going. It is a heavy responsibility, too, since fire makes the meat tender enough to eat easily, its smoke preserves what meat they do not eat immediately, and its frightening light keeps away the fierce night animals. She knows that it is her responsibility because the group of 23 who occupy the cave have talked it over. Not in words, but in significant sounds that mean something to those in the group, a long stride on the road to civilization. 15,000 years ago. A horse develops before him. Red soil from one part of his stone dish has been applied with a pad of moss to the cave wall to block in the basic shape. Now he takes soot and smears it along the figure's back, pointing up its ears. The same black pigment goes into making the legs and the hooves. In the confined space and by the flickering light of his flame, it is difficult for him to stand back and appreciate his work. He knows, however, that he has done it to the best of his ability, and this gives him deep satisfaction. Squeezing through the narrow limestone passage towards the cave mouth, he passes other paintings. Bulls, reindeer, bison and rhinoceros have been depicted there since long before his time. He blows out his flame and stands, dazzled, on a limestone shelf, looking down the hill at the wooded gorge below. Smoke rising against the far cliff shows where his people live, sheltered against the coming winter blast beneath the overhang. He belongs to the species Homo sapiens, subspecies sapiens, and there are probably no more than 10,000 like him in the area that will one day be known as Central France. Further to the north, on the tundra plains of Germany, his cousins Homo sapiens neanderthalensis are now extinct, either wiped out in the latest surge of the Ice Age, or else so interbred with the more successful Homo sapiens sapiens that their characteristics have disappeared in their offspring. It is Homo sapiens sapiens, or Cro-Magnon man, with his artistry and his advanced Paleolithic culture, who will be the ancestor of mankind to come. 5,000 years ago. The river valley has always produced the best plants, and since most food comes from one plant or another, the river valleys of northern Europe are well settled. With the knowledge that plants grow from seed, the people of the settlement have gathered seed and planted it in the fertile valley soil. When the plants are ripe, they are cut down with stone-bladed sickles, and the seeds ground down to flour by rolling them between coarse stones. What can be done for plants can also be done for animals. On the cold plains to the north, people still follow migrating herds of reindeer so that meat is always available. But the settlers can do better than this. Their animals, their cattle, sheep, goats and pigs, are kept penned near the settlements so that meat, wool and milk are constantly accessible. As a result, for the first time in history, substantial houses can be built on frames of tree trunks hewn by the stone implements, walled by dried clay and sticks. Straw, left over from the grain harvest, goes into making the roof. Now there is also time and opportunity for pottery and horn ornaments to be crafted. It is the era known as Neolithic or New Stone Age. The cultivation of plants and the domestication of animals have both heralded this new culture. It will not be long now before the settlers, with their more stable lifestyle and the time to apply their minds to abstract problems, learn to smelt and use metals, first bronze and then iron, and this knowledge will spread throughout most of the populated world. 2,000 years ago. Lucius Septimus chews his twice-cooked bread at the entrance of his hide tent, having cleaned his iron weaponry and his armour. Out there, in the rain, the grey choppy sea that beats against the northern limit of Gaul is an uninviting sight. The wild Britons of the lands to the north have been a thorough nuisance, giving constant aid to rebellious Gauls and holding up the establishment of Roman civilization in these northern lands. Also, it is said that there is great mineral wealth to be had there. Stories abound of wealthy metal merchants making their fortunes by plying these dangerous waters. Certainly the military victory achieved here by the late Julius Caesar was small, but the talk is that other invasions are planned. He certainly hopes not. He would rather be serving in newly annexed Aegyptus at the other end of the empire. Only the generals and the officers in the big tent at the end of the row know what the long-term plans of the new Emperor Augustus are. Lucius merely goes where he is told, and fights where he is told. He feels lucky to be a part of the great nation of Rome, a nation that controls practically the whole world and will do so forever. 1000 years ago. Empire after empire developed around the Mediterranean Sea and spread across Europe, Africa and Asia, clashing with the other empires found there. Then they collapsed, and usually the culture and technology generated with each empire collapsed with it. Eyjolf Asvaldsson understands little of this. He is about to sail home, guided by the stone that seeks the North Star. He does realise, however, that places visited by long ships during the summer raids seem to have different histories and display different ruins. Almost everywhere in the world, shaven men teach the Christian faith and vehemently denounce the sacred names of Thor and Odin, and everywhere the people are adopting this faith, even some of Eyjolf's own people. In this country, the Arab Kingdom of Spain, is a mixture of religions. Dark-skinned peoples who scorn the Christian religion have been settling here for a long time, alongside Christian people. They worship God in domed buildings, surrounded by spindly towers. What's more, they are gardeners and poets, and have a technical knowledge that is lacking elsewhere. Eyjolf's abiding memory of the last raid is of a tower with sails. Ships, like his own, use the wind. They catch it in their sails and it drives them along. These people, however, use the wind to turn wheels and grind grain. 500 years ago. It is 69 days since they set out from Palos, and all that time they have been sailing westwards, except for a brief stop for provisioning in the Canary Islands. Now they have arrived in India. Pablo Diego chides himself for mistrusting the captain. There was no way of telling whether or not the voyage was foolhardy. They just kept sailing westwards, totally the wrong direction for India, to the edge of the world, possibly to be enmired by sticky seaweed or eaten by sea monsters. They could tell how far north or south they were by measuring the angles of the stars, but there was no way of telling how far west they had sailed. Several times he and the crew were on the verge of mutiny. They were wrong, however, and now here they are, safe beneath the palm trees on the warm beach, while offshore the three proud ships lie resting at anchor. It is the Indians that puzzle Pablo. Evidently this is not the mainland of Asia, but one of the outlying islands, possibly the Japans. But where are the fabulous treasures, the gold and jewels that have been promised? Friendly or not, the gifts that the Indians bring are rubbish, beads and strangely coloured birds. Nevertheless, they do have gold rings in their noses, so there is wealth somewhere. If there is, why are the Indians not using it? They seem to have nothing, living in grass huts and growing strange plants for food. That does not worry Pablo. The captain has said that after a brief rest they will sail around more of these islands. He can be sure that further to the west is the main continent, a civilized continent of civilized people who know what to do with their wealth. 100 years ago. The train rattles out from between the narrow paper houses, sending up thick clouds of black smoke that settles as soot on the ornate carvings of the caves, then coughs its way along the low embankment between the flooded fields of rice between the distant cotton mills. If there is anything that emphasizes the changes that have come to Renzo Nariaki's beloved Nippon, it is this. He is an old man now, and he can still remember his place in the feudal society of the Tokugawa shogunate before it was overthrown. Then, with the civil war and the emplacement of the Emperor Meiji, the barbarians who had long been attempting to gain a foothold finally flooded in. They arrived at the request of the new emperor and changed everything. They were altering all aspects of society. At least he still had an emperor, but the government was now like that of a place called France. They still had a navy, but run along the lines of the British Navy. Their industry was being reorganized into the American style, while the army was no longer the army of the samurai, it was now like the army of Germany. The train has disappeared into the dark mills now, ready to pick up a heavy load. The traditional road transport could never have handled the volume of goods now being produced. It is probably like this all over the world, thinks Nariaki. The foreigners are imposing their way of life everywhere. Or perhaps we are absorbing the foreigners' way of life. Time will tell. Part 2. Man After Man. 200 years hence. Pick-a-Blick the Aquamorph. The grey-green of deep water is floored by a bed of rubble, sprouting wisps of red algae and sparse fan coral. Rusting steel hulks, caked with sponge and algal growth, jut up in incomprehensible shapes in the gloom. A few fish move slowly in the dark hollows as the occasional scuffling crab raises brief clouds of sand and silt particles with its pointed feet. Suddenly, these few creatures dart for cover as a much larger shape bounds its way slowly over the bottom. It is streamlined, as are all swimming animals, and its surface is smooth and rounded, all angles padded out by a thick layer of insulating blubber. The legs are somewhat frog-like, with webbed feet, but the webs continue up each side of the leg as far as the knee. The forelimbs are prehensile and adaptable, but for the moment are held tightly against the torso so as not to disrupt the streamlined shape. The creature gives off an air of deep sadness, but only because of the face, with its big dark eyes and enormous lugubrious downturned mouth. The mouth funnels into a broad throat that connects to a wide belt of gills across the chest. It ceases its movement and crouches on the bottom, looking upwards through water above it. Up there is a whole new world, a world that should not be strange since it is the world of the creature's immediate ancestors. Its great-grandfather was a librarian, John Arthur Blick, looking after and cataloguing the accumulated knowledge of centuries of human civilization. Its grandfather, John Blick Jr., was an artist, contributing to that civilization's culture. Its father, John Blick III, was an astrophysicist, adding to the information mankind could draw upon. Now Pick-a-Blick is an aquamorph, a creature engineered to be part of a new frontier. This creature is human. Pick-a-Blick rises slowly towards the undulating silver ceiling that separates home from the hostile environment above. He rarely comes to the surface since he is not directly involved in trading with the land people. Whenever he does, he is always uneasy, even though it was the environment of his parents. A flurry of bubbles arises around him as he ascends towards the surface. Controlling his ascent so that the pressure on his tissues is not released too quickly, he bubbles up through the final few meters and breaks the oily, scum-laden surface. Many of his family are already there. He can just make out their heads bobbing around him amid the floating rubbish. The sky, grey-white with an orange tinge of smog along the horizon, has an alien beauty about it, like the sparkling surface of the unpolluted earth as seen by the first astronauts. He looks towards land, but it is indistinct. His eyes will not function properly because the difference between the refractive index of air and water is such that he cannot focus on anything above the surface. From his utility belt he takes air goggles and slips them over his head. Now he can see clearly. The strip of rubble beach is backed by towering brown and black buildings of the land people. Down coast, the buildings protrude from the sea, built on top of those already submerged, using the drowned hulks as their foundations and piles. The city he sees will not last for long, as the sea levels are continuing to rise, and this area will also have to be abandoned. Not, however, until the establishment has served its purpose. On the flat runway lies a narrow pointed cylinder, too distant for the details to be seen, but Pickablick knows it from descriptions. Beneath the small wings at the rear lie the huge oxygen-compressing rocket engines that will heave the craft off the ground through the successively thinner layers of atmosphere and eventually into orbit. There it will rendezvous with the Starship, transfer its passengers, and return to the runway. The Starship itself is complete and almost ready to go. All his life, Pickablick has been involved in its building. He and his family worked the great underwater deuterium mills that produced the fuel to power it, and farmed the continental shelf to sustain the land dwellers and space dwellers while they constructed it. Before long, fully manned and equipped, it will move out of Earth orbit, build up speed through the solar system, and leave the regions of known space forever. Its departure will mark the end of the work of Pickablick's life. He and his fellow aquamorphs have toiled away, knowing that mankind's future may not lie on this dirty planet or in its polluted waters, but elsewhere in the cosmos. Warning klaxons sound across the water. A flight of scavenging birds takes to the air from the beach as smoke bursts from the tail of the distant craft. After a seeming age, the rumbling war sweeps over the floating observers, and slowly the vessel increases its speed along the runway and lifts itself into the air. Out over the sea towards the watchers it flies, rising as it goes. The sound builds up, and, as the elongated ship hurtles overhead, the impact of the noise disorientates sensory organs more used to picking up waterborne signals. Then the ship is gone, leaving a lingering trail of smoke that slowly dissipates and adds its particles to the weight of atmospheric pollutants that have been building up for the past few centuries. Pickablick and his colleagues watch the ship go. Although excited by the sight, they remain silent because they cannot speak above the water. Quietly, they turn over and dive back into the depths where, as they descend, they can chatter freely to one another. They are home. Kralim the Vacuumorph. Kralim does not take after her mother, nor does she have her father's features. Both her parents were conventional, unengineered humans, exactly like those that flourished and expanded throughout recorded history, reached their peak late in the 20th century, and then declined under the weight of overpopulation, dwindling resources, and hurtling environmental deterioration. The genetic engineers took her ovum and his sperm and altered their genetic makeup according to what would be required for survival away from the Earth's atmosphere, united the two, and let their offspring develop in an extra-uterine environment on the orbiting laboratory 200 kilometers above the decaying Earth. The body matured and developed as a being able to live under conditions of weightlessness. All organs that had evolved to work in conjunction with gravity, legs and feet, hands with palms, sturdy backbone, were suppressed. The new legs and feet looked and worked more like arms and hands, and long fingers grew from muscular wrists. All these emerged from a compact, spherical body designed to contain the pressures of the internal biology. Extra artificial organs that could not yet be developed by genetic manipulation were then inserted, such as the third lung used as a temporary oxygen store, and the fourth lung used as a dump for carbon dioxide and other waste gases. The sealed lens eyes and impermeable vacuum-proof outer skin, grown from tissue cultures in the orbiting biological vats, were later grafted on. The result was Kralim. Throughout history, animals were bred for particular purposes. Cattle were taken from the wild and mated with different strains to produce varieties that developed more milk or more palatable meat. Selective breeding produced dogs with long legs that could hunt swift-footed animals, and dogs with long, narrow bodies that could run down burrows and hunt subterranean animals. It worked. It was part of the influence that civilization had on the natural world. When it came to adapting human beings in the same way, however, that was different. It implied a choice imposed by some individuals upon other individuals. It implied the wielding of a moral power over those who did not share that particular morality. It implied the deviation of human development from its natural course, a course perhaps decreed by a deity. It implied the making, not only of a body, but of a soul, and that soul would not have been acceptable in any of the faiths of the world. You could do all that to animals, but not to human beings. The concept was reviled by the word eugenics. Nevertheless, a time came when ethical considerations had to be compromised. If humanity were to survive, then it had to change. With the old system of selective breeding, the genetic material from one chosen individual was combined with that from another, in the hope that the desired attributes of each would appear in the offspring. It was a gamble. Genetic engineering was different. The precise function of each gene in the human system was now known. It was possible to manipulate it, to kill off a certain gene that produced an undesirable attribute, to add another that would emphasize a particular physical feature. Now beings could be produced to any specification. Now aged 25, Kralim climbs along the outside of the starship's hull, gripping the struts and rungs with her toes and pedal thumbs. Her grip is now an entirely reflex action. Very rarely has she lost her hold and drifted uncontrollably into the void. On such occasions she has been able to return by venting waste gases from her fourth lung and steering herself back to the ship. Some day the engineers will be able to develop some organ that will allow the vacuumorphs some effective locomotion through the vacuum itself. With her pressure-sealed eyes tinted against the glare, she watches for the ferry to rise from the dazzling white and blue of the earth below. She is unsure of its precise arrival time, but hopes that she will see it before she has to return to the interior of the ship. Sooner or later she will need to recharge her third lung with oxygen. At the moment she is quite relaxed, safely protected within her spherical exoskeleton from hard vacuum and cosmic rays, the environment for which she was developed. By custom, Kralim is referred to as she because of the original genetic makeup. The title, however, is a formality, since she is a neuter. Someday, perhaps, it will be possible for a heavily engineered being to breed, but not yet. It took 20 years to build the starship, and it will probably be only the first of many, as eventually mankind, in one form or another, will spread out across the whole of the galaxy. The ship is shaped like two great conical spinning tops, fused nose to nose. The forward cone is the living chamber, a little world in itself that will have to be home to several hundred people for probably as many years. Around the waist is a ring of spherical propellant tanks containing 30,000 tons of helium-3 scooped from the gases of Jupiter's atmosphere and 20,000 tons of deuterium distilled from the Earth's oceans, all compressed into frozen pellets. When running, these pellets will be injected by electromagnetic gun into the aft cone, the reaction chamber, where they will be compressed into a fusion reaction by high-power electron beams. Magnetic fields will direct the continuous blast rearwards, and the entire vessel will move out into unknown space, accelerating continually as it goes, eventually reaching about 15% of the speed of light. The people who go with it will never return. That does not include Kralim, who would not have been sorry to leave Earth orbit. She has never set foot or hand on Earth itself, nor has she ever had any wish to, but she would have liked to travel to another planet, another system around another star. She could never have survived the journey, however, as she was designed for living under the conditions of zero gravity in space. The starship, flying under a constant acceleration, will generate its own gravity and allow non-engineered humans to live without problems. It will be crewed by the non-engineered, but genetic engineers will be amongst the passengers. Who knows what conditions they will meet and need to adapt to on a planet in a distant star system. A glint of light is caught and reflected in her sealed lens. The ferry will soon begin its docking maneuver as it drifts towards the starship. Kralim and her fellows clamber along towards the port to watch. Jemez Smoot, the space traveler. Jemez Smoot can breathe again. The acceleration of the takeoff and the lift to orbit had squashed the breath out of him. Now, as the ferry coasts into freefall, he and his fellow passengers are released from the gravitational grip of his planet, forever. He was trained for the accelerations and the weightlessness, of course, in the acclimatization camp back home, but no amount of training on simulators could have prepared him for the actual power and terror of the real thing. Back home? Yes, he will probably think of Earth as back home for the rest of his life, although he will certainly never go back there. He was taken from his community and subjected to years of rigorous training for survival in a small group, the members of which were drilled to accept, psychologically, that they would be going on a journey from which they would never return, and which could well end in failure and waste rather than the founding of a new civilization. He and his colleagues will abandon everything that they have ever known. They are the lucky ones. No amount of scientific application could have stopped the deterioration of the Earth's environment. No amount of moral guidance or medical technology could have slowed the suicidal birth rate. No amount of exercise of the newfound science of genetic manipulation could induce crops to produce enough food in the right areas to feed all. No amount of political cooperation ensure a fair distribution of what was available. The most influential cultures relied entirely on technology, and stable conditions were necessary for their technologies to flourish. As their systems crumbled, one by one, the less technologically peoples spread to take their place, but inherited the economic systems left by their predecessors, and quickly adopted and rebuilt the highly technological way of life with all the disadvantages and disasters that implied. Desperate and amoral, but practical, choices were made. New beings were genetically engineered to fit into the uninhabitable environments so that new areas could be exploited for the good of the whole. Yet industry still generated its waste products. The carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere rose, and the world sweltered under an accelerating greenhouse effect. The ice caps began to melt, and the sea levels worldwide rose. Already, most of the great cities of the world, those built on deltas, estuaries, and low-lying coasts, were flooded and uninhabitable. Temperatures at the equator became intolerably high, and populations migrated to cooler latitudes, abandoning the stripped rainforests and the desertified grasslands. All this change came about in a mere 2 centuries. But those 2 centuries were the culmination of 4,000 years of burgeoning civilization. Yet, on the time scale of a planet, 200 years, even 4,000 years, were hardly noticeable in the context of the 4,500 million years that the planet had been in existence. We will do it better next time, Jemez Smoot muses as he looks out of the porthole. The dislocated Earth systems are invisible from up here, just the odd smear of brown or yellow showing where smoke is particularly concentrated. Across the cabin, past his companions and through the opposite porthole, he can see the ungainly shape of the starship as they approach it. The airlock on the payload module, surrounded by the tiny figures of the vacuumorphs, beckons invitingly. This will be their new home. Neither he nor his children may be the ones to begin the new civilization on the new planet, but eventually the ship will reach somewhere habitable, and one of his descendants will be part of the new system of humanity, which will benefit from the lessons learned from the mistakes of the old. Kyushu Kristan the Squatty. The moving lights in the sky, glimpsed through a brief break in the clouds, mean nothing to Kyushu Kristan. He had to work hard to steal the meagre portion of food he carries wrapped in his rags, and he cannot let his attention waver from his journey for an instant. Now he has to step quietly over the sleeping huddles that lie in the dry alleyway. Should anyone wake up and sense what he is carrying, then he would have to fight again, and this time, exhausted from his last skirmish, he would not win. His wife and 7 children lie, hungry, in an old culvert beyond the flooded thoroughfare. They had not eaten for 3 days. That was the last time the reliever flew over and dropped food on the drowning city for the squatties. The relief drops were becoming more and more irregular, and Kyushu Kristan knows why. Inland government does not care about its people. All it cares about is producing monsters. Monsters in the seas, monsters in space. As for the weak mockeries of human beings, the hand-fed who have never had to fight for their food in their lives, the soft ones that they are sending to the stars, Kyushu does not even want to think about them. At the entrance of the alley, the road slopes down into the oily water. With his sharp eyes, Kyushu Kristan can make out the tangled tide mark of discarded artifacts, empty containers and decaying bodies that lies along the edge of the water. Tide is out, he registers, so he can wade across. His brother died because he did not have such good eyesight, and would not have noticed whether the tide were in or out. He had not seen the man who lay in wait for him in the darkness as he returned home with his food. Kyushu Kristan hopes that his own children will inherit his sharp eyesight. Sem Kristan died before he could father any children, and so his weak eyesight died with him. Chest deep, Kyushu Kristan crosses the flooded thoroughfare, holding his precious bundle high so that it will not become any more tainted. Slowly, making sure that no ripple breaks and makes a warning noise, he rises from the water at the other side. Yet, as he pulls himself from the water, the silent night shatters into a cacophony of yells and shrieks, bursting from the direction of his sewer home. No, he despairs, not more fighting tonight. Other people do not live like this. The inland people, the ones that have things to do not live like this. There is plenty of food for them, and they do not have to fight. Now his wife Sorelia is yelling, and his children are screaming, and he drops his bundle and runs to help. Sorelia is at the culvert mouth, flaying about her with a steel bar. There are still figures at her feet, and others grabbing her by the arms and legs. Kyushu surprises them all. Seizing the hair of 2 of the attackers, he cracks their heads together with a force that must kill them. Then he turns and fells a 3rd with a blow with the edge of his hand. The others disappear into the darkness, as do the shadowy watchers. Then, while Sorelia calms the frightened children, Kyushu gropes back to where he dropped his bundle, but it has gone, stolen by one of the dark watchers. An exhausted depression creeps over him. Must it always be like this? Sorelia calls to him for help, as she drags the bodies over to the water to deposit them. No point in fouling the entrance of their own home. It is said that the squatties in the next city eat the victims of a fight like this. That would be practical, but inhuman, although Kyushu could believe anything of them. Their attackers appear to be from across the water, probably on their way back from a raid, and their ragged pouches are full of stolen food, fair compensation for the food that Kyushu has lost, so he does not feel so bad now. 6 men have been killed, which is a good total for such a skirmish. He and Sorelia can feel proud of the night's work. There may be monsters in the sea and monsters in space, and the weaklings can be sent to the stars, but it is here, in the squats of the drowning cities, that true men and women are still to be found. 300 years hence, Haron Solto and his mechanical cradle. Haron Solto opens his eyes to the soothing light display on his ceiling. Gentle scents exude from the walls, and a hot drink appears instantly in the alcove by his hand. He speaks a word that would have been meaningless to 20th century people, but it banishes the light display and surrounds him with bland walls. He lifts his one good hand and takes the beaker of drink. The cakes of synthetic protein that constitute the first meal of his day immediately appear behind it. The tastes are delicious, synthetically produced, but delicious. Having eaten his first meal, he goes for his hygiene session. By moving one finger of his wizened left hand, contact is made and his cradle hums and moves his body towards the ablutoire. The whole contrivance, mechanical and biological, travels on its magnetic levitation motors across the chamber towards the arch that houses the ultrasonic cleansers. All the switches and contacts for his cradle are within reach of the little fingers on his left hand. A panel above them shows him instantly that all his life support systems are working. The cultured kidneys distill, the synthetic liver produces the chemicals that help the digestion of his first meal, the external lungs circulate enough purified air, the metal heart pumps blood through the biological part of his being, and all the motors, relays and servo mechanisms that provide the mobility of the unit function properly. Time for his day's work. Away below him, in tunnels deep within the earth, lie the protein factories. Fully automatic and never seen by humans, except for the handlers who repair and maintain them, the factories use the power generated by the mountainside full of solar cells to turn raw carbon dioxide and oxygen from the air and water from the reservoirs into edible carbohydrates. Elsewhere lie the machines that simulate the biological processes that produce edible protein, and still other factories house vats that produce the flavors and textures that are added later to the world's food supply and help to change food from a mere nutritional necessity to an art form. On his personal display, Haran Salto sees the figures for the day's world requirements, its preferred geographical distribution, the output from the various factories, and the flow of the transportation systems. With a practiced eye, he reads the graphs and evaluates the estimates. Then 3 quick presses of a button, and the day's production is in balance. He can rest. The motor units of his cradle lift him away from his workstation. Today he will contemplate his sculpture collection, which always gives him peace of mind. He sweeps across the room to where the 3-dimensional images are housed, but beneath the healthy hum of the levitation motors there is another sound, a hissing and grinding noise. His forward motion ceases abruptly, an edge of his cradle tilting and scraping the floor. Panic! No, don't panic. It can all be controlled. Punching a button, he injects the right amount of sedative into his system to regain calm. It was a minor malfunction of his locomotor system, nothing more. Summon up one of the handlers, immediately. After a short time, a time when Haran Salto is beset by thoughts generated by helplessness and indecision, the handler appears in the external door. He is a primitive, like Haran Salto's ancestors must have been, and obviously male. He walks without mechanical aid, and his body is symmetrical, with 2 arms and 2 legs. Like all handlers, he will have been taken from the outside ruins. Their versatility makes them useful, and they are willing to perform distasteful functions in return for food and comfort. This creature has few mechanical appliances, but his body is covered with an insulating clothing, and he carries a bag of instruments around his shoulder. Salto tries to close his mind to the disgust he feels, but has to acknowledge that these people are necessary. With a few words, in a dialect that Haran Salto can hardly understand, the handler diagnoses the problem and sets to work. A panel of the cradle is removed, then tools and artifacts are brought out of the handler's bag and fixed into the mysterious innards of the machine. It all takes place out of Haran Salto's sight. The inside of the cradle is something he has never seen and has no wish to see. All he perceives is the hairy top of the handler's head as he bows over his work, making a humming noise with his lips and teeth, a noise that Haran Salto surmises passes for music. The experience is too much. Haran Salto blasts some narcotic into his vein and drifts into a more pleasant substitute world. He is roused by a loud slam as the panel of his cradle is rammed home. The handler says 2 brief words to him. The first denotes work done, and the second is a mode of address, basically respectful, but which, Haran Salto suspects, has now become a term of amusement and mild mockery amongst the handlers. Haran Salto dismisses the man, having first endorsed his identity chip to say that the work has been done. Haran Salto is alone once more, fully functioning, and can continue his day's reverie. Someday humanity will not need these grotesque throwbacks to primitive man. There will be a better method than the present mechanical contrivances. A system that lives, grows and repairs itself. That is for the future, however, and someone else will have to develop it. Grirath Holm and the Future. Humanity has a potential which cannot be bound by mere machines. There must be a better way forward. These are thoughts that have beset Greerath Holm ever since she witnessed the last failure of the local food generator. It was a terrible time, during which the handlers fought amongst themselves. On one side, the disciplined faction struggled to repair the breakage. On the other, those whose food supplies had been cut off first were trying to break into the machinery to feed on the raw materials. Order was restored, but only through massacre. What had human beings come to now? Wizened bodies encased in machines, kept alive by mechanical contrivance and synthetically grown organs. Once, a long, long time ago, humanity developed through the process of evolution. With the coming of intelligence and civilization, this natural process was swept away. Medical science developed, and those that would have died off were now able to survive and reproduce. As a result for man, the directive force of evolution, the process of natural selection, was eliminated. In consequence, the species deteriorated. Unhealthy changes that would have been wiped out now survived and were spread. The genetic stock became weaker as populations became bigger. This did not matter, because medical science was always there to sustain life. No matter how degenerate a human body became, there were always the technological systems to keep it alive. The result was certainly a triumph over the raw wildness of nature, but there must be a better way. Machines keep breaking down, and the food and drug supplies are constantly disrupted. Synthetic organs must hold the key. If they improve, muses Greerath, that would put her and many like her out of work. She controls the manufacturing process for a series of synthetic enzymes and stimulants that benefit humans the world over. That might not be a bad thing. She would like to devote more of her time to listening to music, looking at art, and wallowing in the newly developing medium of hypnotic involvement drama. Then, with a start, she remembers two friends who recently retired from work to do just that, and both of them switched off their life supports after a few days. Probably their stimulant mix was wrong, something that will not happen to Greerath. After all, she is in the business. Genetic engineering must be the future, though. Humans have already dabbled in it during the last century, when it produced beings that could live in space. That was specifically for work on the Star Colony project. So, as always in history, a specific emergency or a specific goal fueled a burst of technological development. In the past, it was always warfare that provided the emergency. The technology usually involved the development of more sophisticated weaponry. Then, as ever, once the emergency passed and the goal was attained, the newly developed technology fell fallow. Now that the Star Colony project has come to an end and the last of the 37 ships has been dispatched, there are no more space children. Those vacuumorphs were never perfect. They were not so much bred as built up from pieces grown synthetically, and there was never a possibility that they would reproduce. The aquamorphs, the humans engineered to live in the sea, are still there though, living in the warmer waters of the ocean. A veritable underwater civilization is developing. A burst of sunlight from behind the clouds, slanting down the fissures between the tall buildings, cut to geometric dapples by the supporting girder-work and discoloured by the translucent filters of Greerath's habitat, creeps into her living unit and brings her out of her daydream. Her day's work is almost over, and she has hardly done a thing. Once, she thinks, mankind was ruled by the sun. When it rose, people woke up and started their day, and when it set, they slept. Now nobody could care if the sun were there or not, as long as it powered the solar cells and kept the ocean currents churning away and driving the submerged energy units. Out there, where people no longer go, there are wild spaces on the planet. For a while these were poisoned. Now all that has changed. The big animals have gone, all right, but the plants have re-established themselves. Steamy tropical forests are growing again along the equator, and grasslands lie in belts to the north and south. Further north and south are the spacious deserts that, because of the natural pattern of circulation of the wind and moisture, will never be fertile. Beyond these there are deciduous and coniferous forests, then towards the north and south poles lie the cold tundra regions and the ice caps. Guirath knows of all these things from the information banks, but the subjects with which she is most familiar are found in old recordings. The tropical forests she now visualizes were full of monkeys, tapirs, anteaters, snakes, sloths, apes, jaguars, hummingbirds, toucans, and eagles. The grasslands were alive with herds of zebra, elephant, antelope, giraffe, and pursued by lions, cheetahs, and hyenas. The deciduous and coniferous forests had deer, beavers, squirrels, badgers, wolves, and lynx. The tundra supported reindeer, musk ox, and foxes. She knows that now these animals are all gone, and are as relevant to the modern world as are the dinosaurs, the moas, and the mammoths. Today, these habitats are open and silent, with only the smallest rodents and birds living there, along with insects and other invertebrates. Surely out here should be the future of mankind. If so, a renewed campaign of genetic engineering could be the means of reaching it. Hui Chum and his love. It is probably the most dangerous and most exciting time of his life. Hui Chum is slowly and purposefully disconnecting himself from his cradle. For a few brief minutes he will be isolated from the things that keep him alive, but it will be worth it. He has been preparing for months. Gradually his physicians have been turning off his libido suppressant. He has been trained thoroughly as to when to switch off this device and that organ. Those that are fundamentally necessary to his continued existence are connected to trailing cables and tubes, vulnerable but necessary for the essential few minutes. He is luckier than most. His heart is his own. It is almost time. His senses tell him that Bernida, his love, is outside the door. He has seen her before, but only on screens and holograms, and was first attracted to her by the way that she had decorated her cradle. He realized that this attraction was not as superficial as it seemed. Her artistic taste showed that deep down she was similar, and that they would make a good mating pair. She approved, as did all her colleagues, physicians, and relatives. The environmental lights dim to a soft hue, and the ambient odors and music produce a gentle and seductive atmosphere. The access slides open, and Bernida's cradle wafts in. He is seeing her for the first time without the help of mechanical media. Only her face, of course, is visible, and it looks a little smaller than he expected. The decorations on her cradle are bright and flamboyant, as befit the occasion. Inside the mechanisms, he knows she has switched off her life supports for the short time necessary. She smiles at him, and he returns the smile, the first purely personal communication he has had with anybody. The cradles drift together and their touching panels open. The lights go out, for who wants to see the wizened, deformed body of a naked human, however much in love they are? Hydraulic arms, supporting the little bodies in their harnesses, swing out until they meet. It is much, much later. Hui Chum's shock is beginning to wear off and grief is settling in, but that can be dealt with by suitable injections. He is back in his cradle where he is safe. He is never coming out again as long as he lives. Never. He thought that he and Bernida were well matched, not only mentally and emotionally, but physically too. Like him, she had her own heart, but hers was not nearly as strong as his, and the strain of mating was too much. He can console himself that he is not alone, as only about 10% of matings these days are successful. If this goes on, the human species will dwindle and die out. Aquatics. The sea waves, blasted by a southwestern gale, curdle and foam in cold blue slopes that march remorselessly across the desolate surface of the northern ocean. From the lead-grey sky the chill rain hisses down in the icy green hollows, and is lost in the streaming foam of the crests. The sea surface is not a welcoming place. Below the screaming, tumbling chaos of the surface and in the top few feet of the ocean water, the gale is silenced, the waves suppressed to a gentle to and fro motion. Further down, the movement becomes weaker and weaker, until it dies away completely. This is the world of the fish, and of the creatures that have abandoned their life on land to accept their ancestral home in the great oceans of the world. To some extent, the sea otters did this, with their sinuous bodies and their webbed feet. The seals and walruses did it more efficiently with their streamlining and their flippers, but the now extinct dolphins and the great whales did it to perfection, even adopting the fish shape of their forebears. Now humans have done it too. In the green half-light below the ocean's turbulence they swim. An unaccustomed eye might have taken them for dolphins, moving and turning, dashing away in a sudden streak, hanging for a while motionless. They cannot breathe air, these creatures of the ocean. Instead, they circulate the sea-water through their mouths and pectoral gills, extracting the oxygen as it goes. They also feed constantly, filtering plankton through the same gills and transferring it to the digestive system. Now and again they take a fish, turning and streaking after it with a twist of the tail fin, a balance of the arms, and a quick bite. The tail fin is all that is left of the human legs. In embryo, the limb buds grow together and fuse into one organ. The hip girdle does not develop, and the limb bones become almost an extension of the backbone. The phalanges of the toes spread and shape themselves into a network that supports the powerful diamond-shaped fin. The hands retain their human structure, but the arm has flattened and become modified into a balancing and stabilizing organ. The development was started a century ago as part of the Star Colony project, but the creatures developed were only partially successful. Later, the engineering laboratories, in a last bid to produce something permanent before being closed down, refined the design and produced a truly aquatic human being, and, their final triumph, the genetic changes that they produced were actually hereditary. Yes, these newly developed creatures were fertile and produced viable offspring. The process really started way back in the early days of civilization, when man's quest to possess all the things of the world took him to the water. He invented mechanical devices that enabled him to take his air down into the sea with him and to breathe it as a workable pressure. Implements strapped to his body allowed him to see under water and to swim with powerful leg strokes. As time went on, great communities, rather like island cities, were established on the seabed. The sediment-choked ruins of these still litter the continental shelves. When genetic engineering was developed, gills could be cultivated from raw tissue and grafted onto the human body, enabling humans to breathe like fish. This was still clumsy and imprecise compared with the later engineering of a creature with no need of cities or artificial swimming and breathing devices. What swims here is merely the surface race of the creature. In the blackness below, hundreds of fathoms down, others exist, rarely seen by any but their own kind, and even then they are not strictly seen. In the blackness they can only feel their way about and communicate with one another by a kind of echolocation. These creatures are sluggish and inactive. There is little food at these depths, and they must conserve what energy they have. Since the aquatics rarely meet any other form of human, there is no enmity between them and any other group. A female suckling a wriggling youngster undulates gracefully towards a group of males who are chasing fish. She speaks. The voice is a rattling sound, produced from clicks in the relict windpipe in the neck. The young males clatter their reply and swim off in what seems to be a random three-dimensional pattern. Suddenly the fish with which they were sporting congregate in a mass in front of the female's head, herded there by the precisely coordinated movements of the males. A quick flick and a snap and she has swallowed one, the rest scattering into the green murk. She clucks her thanks to the males and swims sedately away. To look at, one would think that these are creatures that had existed in this environment since the world was young. It is only the face, a grotesque parody of the human face, with big bulging eyes, tiny degenerate nose and down-turned mouth, that shows it to be derived from a human being. 500 years hence, Graham, the engineered plains dweller. Graham stands shivering on the dusty plain, not shivering with cold, but with apprehension. The spiky grass round about is familiar enough. He has been brought up on a diet of it since he was born 10 years ago. During that 10 years, though, all the grass he knew had been grown in the habitat module. He was brought up and cosseted by family, a group of creatures that saw to his every need and trained him for life outside. Only in the last 2 years did he realize that he was not like the people of family. He was not encased in metallic outer skins. He did not glide along the floor, and cables and tubes did not spiral out of him, connecting him to glass and plastic devices. And his face. The faces were the only parts of family that he could see directly, and his was nothing like theirs. Now he is on his own, and he knows it. Family cannot live out here on the grassy plains, so they are all congregated together in the flying machine behind him. All this landscape before him is to be his. Delicately he steps away from the flying module. Beneath his tapering foot the fibrous soil feels strange, not quite like the soil in the habitat. He can feel the eyes of family on him as he wades into the sharp, waving grass, scanning him closely as he knew they would. Not only are they watching him directly, but the little instruments that are strapped to various parts of his body are sending back signals, telling them how he is performing. He knows what he is supposed to do. He has been trained for long enough. As in the habitat, he reaches with his long arm and long hand and grasps a bunch of grass. The calloused cutting edge of his hand shears through the stems and leaves with a twisting motion, and he thrusts the bunch into his mouth and begins chewing. His big teeth grind into the stringy plant material, crushing it to a pulp and disrupting the fibers. He can feel the toughness and knows that the wear on his teeth will be immense. He also knows that once a tooth is worn out, another one will grow to replace it, and this will happen for the rest of his life, another thing that makes him different from the members of family. He swallows the wad of grass, and down it tumbles into his voluminous stomach, where it is met by specially engineered bacteria that complete the digestion. He scythes off another handful and eats it. This is working all right, he thinks, and hopes that family thinks so too. He looks up to the horizon, a vast distance away. So this is to be his new home. With sudden joy, Graham bounds away towards a clump of low bushes. He could be happy here, no matter what family think. Suddenly, he does not care what family think. This is not their world, it is his. Then, in a first and final gesture of defiance, he rips off the instruments that are strapped to his body and flings them away into the dusty grass. Cool Tehran and the engineered forest dweller. Cool Tehran looks down at the huge oval shadow of the flyer falling on the top of the tropical rain clouds, surrounded by a rainbow ring of spectral colours. As the vessel descends, the clouds clear away below it, and the vast stretch of green forest reaches out as an unbroken carpet with dark rivers winding across it. The flyer's shadow on the treetops is now fuzzy and unclear, but soon it comes into focus, and the edges become sharper as it descends. Now individual trees can be seen, and with an uneven crunch the vast vessel settles amongst the broken branches and boughs. Cool Tehran looks around him at the rainforest. It is not as it once was. A few centuries ago, the first rainforest was all destroyed, as a burgeoning population of humans spread into it and removed it, clearing it away to make room for them to grow food. It was a disaster, not only removing the entire forest and its animal life from the face of the earth, but also producing subtle changes to the climate the world over. Such problems are all past now that there are more efficient ways of producing food. The forests have returned, but not in their old state. The forest soil, which has taken millions of years to build up, was nearly all washed away in the bad times, so the trees that have repopulated the area are not the magnificent trees of old. They are scrubby and hardy, adapted to find a root-hold in what soil there is left, but the hot climate and the constant rain has made them grow prolifically. No big animals exist, though. With the great trees of old went the monkeys, apes, jaguars, parrots, toucans, tapirs, squirrels, opossums, okapis, and bongos. There are plenty of small things, insects, spiders, millipedes, lizards, snakes, and many of the smaller birds, but the bigger mammals and birds have gone forever. Now, however, they are to be replaced. In the module behind Kul Turan is the prototype of the new forest creature. Mankind has civilized himself into a synthetic corner. He cannot survive without the full power of engineering science and medical technology. He has turned his back on the natural systems of evolution and ecology that brought him into being in the first place. Now, as the technological systems are beginning to fail more and more frequently, it is time to look back to the natural environments. The Andlers were overlooked for so long. Once despised because of their unsophistication, but tolerated because of their versatility and ability to keep the machines working, they are now recognized as the gene pool for the future of mankind. It is so obvious. Mankind was in a shambles because it had turned its back on the natural process of evolution. The Andlers, however, after the great schism of humanity brought about by the overpopulation and famine disasters of a few centuries ago, had fallen off the hurtling escalator of technological complexity. They represented the part of humanity that had been thrown to the wild and denied the advantages of the constantly improving technology and culture. These unfortunate creatures lived as best they could and suffered terribly from diseases and accidents. It was these that reinstated the process of natural selection, and as an ironic result, the surviving members became fitter and healthier generation by generation. It eventually became obvious to the mainstream of technological man, however much his soul rebelled against it, however much his ego denied it, that here lay the purest essence of humanity now surviving. This is the basis for the humanity of the future. From now on, man should not use his science to change the environment to suit himself. Rather, he should use it to change himself to suit his environment. By his own technological application, he can catch up with the thousands of years of evolutionary change that he has forfeited. It is now possible to breed and genetically manipulate new creatures that do not need a technological civilization. Out there, in the tropical jungle, the grasslands, the deciduous woodlands, the coniferous forests, and the tundra, are supplies of food growing wild. All the necessities for life are there. If the human body can be regarded as a machine, like a life support cradle, then the carbohydrates produced in the leaves and tubers can be used as the body's fuel. The proteins in the growing shoots and in the insects can be used as building materials. The vitamins in all living things can be used for lubrication, and the water that is found everywhere can be used for cooling and cleaning. All this goodness was once harvested by a vast range of big animals. There are none left now, and all the food is there for the taking. Kul Turan looks at the creature in the transportation module. Strange that this should represent mankind of the future. It looks so much like mankind of the past. The prehensile feet are there, with the big toe modified as a thumb for climbing and grasping branches. The long ape-like arms and the long fingers will also help it to move about in the treetop canopy. The head seems to be very heavy about the jaw to accommodate the huge nut-cracking teeth. The genetically engineered beings that have been developed for the other vacant habitats seem to be working well, according to the reports. Now they must see how the tropical forest version performs. The naked form of Pan, sitting amongst the bars and perches of his module, seems ready for his great adventure. He exchanges a few words with Kul Turan, who then opens the access of the module. Pan leaps from the vessel and into the swaying, wispy branches of the nearest bush. He hangs there for a moment while he looks around at the infinite vistas of his new home. Then, with a final wave to those who had nurtured and developed him, he jumps to the nearest tree, shins up the trunk, and is lost to sight amongst the branches. Kul Turan turns away from the window and back to his console. Physically, the new creatures seem to work well. The next stage is to see if they can breed true. Nut, the engineered tundra dweller. Mosses, lichens, heathers, coarse grasses. Very meagre fare. Yet such a diet used to support very large animals like reindeer, musk ox, and mammoth. So there is no reason to suppose that a suitably engineered human could not subsist on such a diet. Nut has been raised on it for a decade, but that was in the safety of a living module. The cold weather plants were brought in regularly by flying machine, and the chill conditions were maintained artificially. All this time, family have been outside in the warm and looking in. Now the situation is reversed. The family members, in their cradles, with all their delicate life supports, are keeping warm in the modules of the flying machine, while Nut is outside, standing in the crisply frosted grass of the tundra wilderness, beneath the vast cold grey and white sky. This is what he was brought up for, to take his place in nature. Centuries ago, there were herds of big animals here, which moved north and south as the seasons changed, wintering in the deep forests to the south, and spending the summer on these wild plains. In those days, he was told, there were fierce hunting animals as well, animals that would harry and kill the gentle plant-eaters. Now there are none of those left either, and the whole landscape is his. He looks down at the coarse little plants at his feet. They look the same as those he has been eating all his life. With the ice hook developed from the nail on his big toe, he scrapes up a patch of moss, then he goes down onto his furry knees and scoops it up with his spade-like hand. Yes, it tastes just the same. He will survive here. The whiteness that has been building up at one side of the sky descends. Chill flakes of snow begin to swirl past him, settling on his fine curled fur over the layers of fat. In reaction, he rolls up the ruff of fat around his neck and his face disappears into it. From the direction of the great flying ship behind him, he can hear the clang and hiss of hatches and accesses closing and sealing. This is too much for family. There is a sudden blast of warm air as the great vessel leaves the ground. They are going back to the cities where it is warm. Nut is left here, where he belongs. Yet too much harsh weather will kill him, and the brief northern summer is over. He knows what he must do. As the sudden flurry of snow passes, he brings his face out from the folds of fat and turns it towards the south, where away yonder are the huge coniferous forests and winter shelter. Like the great herds of grazing animals before him, he moves southwards with the season. Yet, unlike the animals of the vast seething herds, he is alone, the only one of his kind, but this does not worry him. If he survives, and he has every intention of doing so, then the experiment will be a success. Others like him will be produced, and together they will repopulate the chill northern wastes of the planet. Relia Hulan and cultured cradles. This is not the way. Taking antlers and changing them into wild animals is not the way. Mankind's fate does not lie with these low creatures, but with those who have sustained the technological advances over the centuries. If mankind's future is not one of technological progress, then what is it? Relia Hulan and her team have worked for decades on the problem, learning from the genetic experiments of centuries, and at last she has the potential for success. For long enough, it has been possible to grow synthetic kidneys, livers, lungs, and many other organs. It was the connective tissues and the locomotor systems that were elusive. It is hundreds of years since a child was born that was free of genetic defects and able to live without a vast